43. Baby witnessed mother bear saving triplets. During complicated birth, everyone was in tears. The mountain air hung thick and still that September morning, carrying none of its usual whispers through the pine branches. Ethan Marshall pressed his palm against the cold window of their cabin, watching his breath fog the glass as he searched the tree line for movement. Something felt different about today, though he couldn't name what it was. The forest had gone quiet in a way that made his photographer's instincts sharpen, the same feeling he got moments before capturing something extraordinary through his lens. Behind him, Lily Morgan hummed softly to their 3-month-old daughter, the gentle melody the only sound breaking through the unusual silence that had settled over their remote home like a heavy blanket. They had chosen this isolation deliberately, moving to the cabin 6 months ago when Lily discovered she was pregnant. The decision hadn't been easy, leaving behind the convenience of city life for the uncertainty of mountain living. But something about this place had called to them both. Maybe it was the way the morning light filtered through the towering evergreens, painting golden patterns on the forest floor. Maybe it was the promise of raising their child surrounded by nature's raw beauty, far from the noise and rush of modern life. Now, as Ethan watched the motionless trees, he wondered if the forest had been waiting for them all along, preparing to reveal something they needed to witness. The first sign came as a shadow moving between the trees, too large and deliberate to be the deer they usually spotted at dawn. Ethan reached for his camera instinctively, the weight of it familiar and comforting in his hands. Through the telephoto lens, he caught sight of her, a massive grizzly bear, her coat the color of dark honey catching the filtered sunlight. But something was wrong with the picture. Bears didn't move like this, slow and purposeful, especially not this close to human habitation. Her gait was heavy, labored, and she kept stopping every few steps as if gathering strength to continue. The bear wasn't foraging or exploring. She was coming directly toward their cabin with an intention that made Ethan's heart rate quicken. "Lily," he called softly, not wanting to startle the baby. "You need to see this." His voice carried a mixture of awe and concern that brought Lily to the window immediately, their daughter cradled against her chest. Together, they watched as the bear emerged fully from the forest's edge, now only 50 yards from their home. In all his years photographing wildlife, Ethan had never seen anything like this. The bear's eyes weren't wild or aggressive. They held something else entirely, something that made him lower his camera and simply watch. She moved with difficulty, her massive body swaying with each step, and then she did something that made both Ethan and Lily catch their breath. She looked directly at their window, holding their gaze for a long moment before continuing her approach. The bear stopped 30 feet from their cabin, in a small clearing they could see perfectly from their living room window. She circled the spot slowly, pawing at the ground with movements that seemed almost ritualistic. Lily's hand found Ethan's, squeezing it gently as they watched this enormous creature prepare what looked like a nest in the soft earth and fallen pine needles. The baby stirred in Lily's arms, making small cooing sounds that seemed to echo the strange anticipation building in the room. Neither of them spoke, afraid that even whispered words might break whatever spell had brought this magnificent animal to their doorstep. As the bear settled into the depression she had created, her breathing became more labored, visible even from their distance. Her sides heaved with each breath, and occasionally a low sound escaped her. Not quite a growl, more like a deep sigh that carried across the clearing. Ethan had photographed bears before, had studied their behavior for years, but this was entirely outside his experience. Bears sought solitude for important moments, especially vulnerable ones. They didn't approach human dwellings unless driven by hunger or desperation, and this bear showed no signs of either. She seemed to have chosen this spot, this proximity to them, for reasons that defied everything he knew about animal behavior. The hours passed slowly, marked only by the changing angle of sunlight through the trees and the bear's increasingly restless movements. She would stand, circle her makeshift nest, and settle again, each time seeming more uncomfortable than the last. Lily had moved to the rocking chair by the window, nursing the baby while keeping watch. Ethan had set up his camera on a tripod, not to photograph, but to observe through the powerful lens, noting every detail of the bear's condition. Her belly was massively swollen, the reason for her labored movement now obvious. She was pregnant, heavily so, and by the looks of her behavior, very close to giving birth. "Why here?" Lily whispered, the first words either of them had spoken in over an hour. "Why would she come here so close to us?" Ethan shook his head, having no answer that made sense. In nature, vulnerability meant seeking safety in isolation, not proximity to potential threats. Yet this bear had deliberately chosen to be near them, and more mysteriously she kept looking toward their window. Not with fear or aggression, but with what Ethan could only describe as awareness. She knew they were watching, and somehow, impossibly, she seemed to want them there. The baby had fallen asleep in Lily's arms, her tiny face peaceful and unaware of the extraordinary scene unfolding outside. Ethan found himself thinking about the strangeness of the moment. 3 parents, if you could call the bear that, connected by the invisible thread of impending and recent birth. He had read about animals seeking help from humans in desperate situations, dolphins guiding swimmers to shore, elephants approaching villages when injured, but this felt different. The bear wasn't injured, at least not visibly. She had simply chosen them as witnesses to something sacred and primal. As afternoon melted into evening, the forest began to wake from its strange silence. Birds returned to the trees, their songs tentative at first, then growing bolder. Small creatures rustled in the underbrush, keeping a respectful distance from the laboring bear. The whole forest seemed to be holding vigil, waiting for whatever was about to unfold. Ethan prepared simple sandwiches for dinner, neither of them willing to leave their post by the window for a proper meal. They ate in silence, watching as the bear's contractions became visible, her body tensing and releasing in waves that looked remarkably similar to what Lily had experienced just 3 months ago. "I remember that feeling," Lily said softly, her hand unconsciously moving to her still soft belly. "That moment when your body takes over, and you realize you're just along for the ride." Ethan wrapped his arm around her shoulders, feeling the slight tremble in her body. Whether from memory or empathy, he wasn't sure. The bear let out a long, low moan that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself, a sound so deeply maternal that it transcended species. Even their sleeping baby stirred slightly, as if responding to some ancient call that predated language or thought. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that would normally have Ethan reaching for his camera. But he couldn't look away from the bear, couldn't break this strange communion they had entered. She was standing again, pacing in tight circles, her movements more urgent now. Every few minutes she would stop and look directly at their window, and each time Ethan felt that look like a physical touch. It wasn't a plea exactly, but something close to it. An acknowledgement, perhaps, that they were part of this moment whether they understood it or not. Lily had started humming again, the same soft melody she used to soothe the baby. The sound drifted through the slightly open window, and incredibly the bear's ears swiveled toward it. She stopped pacing, standing perfectly still for a moment, listening. Then she did something that made both Ethan and Lily gasp. She took 3 deliberate steps toward the cabin, closing the distance to barely 20 feet. At this range, they could see every detail of her face, the intelligence in her dark eyes, the way her mouth opened slightly as she panted through another contraction. "She's not afraid," Ethan whispered in amazement. "She's not afraid of us at all." And it was true. Everything about the bear's body language suggested not just tolerance of their presence, but something approaching trust. It went against every instinct these wild creatures possessed, every evolutionary imperative that kept them alive. Yet here she was, in her most vulnerable moment, choosing to be near them. Choosing, Ethan realized with a start, to share this with them. The first stars were appearing in the darkening sky when the bear's water broke, a gush of fluid that darkened the earth beneath her. She let out a sound that was part growl, part cry, and wholly universal in its expression of pain and determination. Lily's hand tightened on Ethan's, and he could feel her breathing change, matching the rhythm of the laboring bear, as if her body remembered its own recent trial. The baby woke, not crying, but alert, her dark eyes reflecting the last light of day as she watched her parents watch the window. They had moved closer to the glass now, close enough that their breath fogged it repeatedly. The bear was on her side, her massive body heaving with effort. In the dying light, Ethan could see the contractions rippling across her belly, powerful waves that seemed to shake her entire frame. Between contractions, she would lift her head and look at them, those intelligent eyes holding theirs for long moments before another wave of pain demanded her attention. It was during one of these looks that Ethan saw something that made his photographer's eye widen. A tear, an actual tear, rolling from the bear's eye. "Do bears cry?" Lily asked, having seen it too. Ethan didn't know. In all his research, all his time observing wildlife, he had never heard of such a thing. But there it was, undeniable in the fading light. This magnificent creature was crying, and somehow, impossibly, it felt like she was sharing that vulnerability with them. The boundary between human and animal, observer and observed, was dissolving in the growing darkness, leaving only the universal experience of birth and its attendant struggles. The moon had risen, full and bright, casting silver light across the clearing when the real work began. The bear's pushes were visible now, her whole body straining with effort. Ethan had set up a small camping lantern on their porch, providing just enough light to see without disturbing the natural darkness. The bear didn't react to the artificial light, too deep in her labor to care about anything beyond the ancient imperative driving her body. Her breathing had changed, becoming more rhythmic, purposeful. Even from their distance, they could see the intensity of her focus, the complete absorption in the task at hand. "The first one's coming," Lily breathed, her words barely audible. She was right. In the lantern's gentle glow, they could see the beginning of birth, the crown of a tiny head emerging. The bear curved her massive body, trying to see, to help, her movements careful despite her size. The sight was simultaneously alien and familiar, the same process Lily had gone through rendered magnificent and strange by its wild setting. The baby in Lily's arms seemed to sense the importance of the moment, staying unusually quiet, and still, her little fingers wrapped around her mother's thumb. The first cub emerged in a rush of fluid and motion, a tiny, dark form against the earth. But something was wrong. Even from their distance, Ethan and Lily could see that the cub wasn't moving. The mother bear nudged it gently with her nose, a touch so delicate from such a powerful creature that it seemed impossible. She licked the cub, cleaning it, stimulating it, but still it lay motionless. The bear's sounds changed, becoming higher, more desperate. She looked at the cabin window, and in that look was something so human, so utterly maternal that Lily let out a small sob. "Oh, no," she whispered, pressing her face against Ethan's shoulder. "Please, no." They watched as the mother bear continued her ministrations, refusing to give up on the still form. She would pause in her efforts only when another contraction seized her, reminding her that the birth was not complete. 2 more cubs still waited to be born, but her attention kept returning to the first, lifeless one. The scene was heartbreaking in its raw display of maternal instinct, the refusal to accept what seemed inevitable. The second cub came more quickly, sliding into the world with a small cry that carried across the clearing. This one moved immediately, a tiny, blind creature seeking warmth and milk. The mother bear positioned it carefully, torn between tending to the living cub and continuing her desperate attempts to revive the first. Her movements were frantic but precise, a dance of grief and hope that needed no translation. Ethan found himself holding his breath, willing the first cub to move, to breathe, to show any sign of life. The forest had gone completely silent again, as if every creature within hearing was holding vigil for this small life. The only sounds were the bear's increasingly desperate vocalizations and the small mews of the second cub. The moon had risen higher, bathing the entire scene in ethereal light that made it seem like something from a dream or ancient myth. Lily was crying openly now, silent tears streaming down her face as she clutched their own baby closer. The parallel was too obvious, too powerful. They were watching every parent's nightmare unfold in the wild. The third cub arrived with the mother bear barely pausing in her attempts to revive the first. She had been working on the still cub for nearly 20 minutes now, licking it, nudging it, even picking it up gently in her mouth and repositioning it. The third cub, like the second, was moving and crying, but the mother's attention remained fixed on the first. Her sounds had changed again, becoming something that could only be described as mournful, a deep, resonant cry that seemed to come from the very core of her being. "She won't give up," Ethan said, his own voice thick with emotion. "She won't give up on it." And she didn't. Even as the 2 living cubs sought her warmth, she continued her desperate work on the first. She would gather all 3 against her body, then return to the still one, repeating her efforts with a determination that defied exhaustion. The scene was simultaneously beautiful and heartbreaking, a testament to the power of maternal love that transcended species boundaries. It was then that something extraordinary happened. The bear stood, and for a moment Ethan and Lily thought she was going to leave, to accept the loss and focus on the surviving cubs. Instead, she picked up the still cub gently in her mouth and took several steps toward the cabin. She stopped just 15 feet from the window and laid the cub down carefully in a patch of moonlight. Then she looked directly at them, a long, sustained gaze that felt like a question, a plea, something beyond their understanding but impossible to ignore. "What does she want?" Lily whispered, but even as she asked, they both knew. It was impossible, went against every rule of wildlife interaction. But the bear's intention was clear. She was asking for help, not demanding, not threatening, just asking with those intelligent eyes that held more pain and hope than any wild animal should possess. Ethan's mind raced through possibilities, through all the reasons this was dangerous and wrong, but he kept coming back to those eyes, to the tears he had seen, to the universal language of a mother's desperation. "We can't," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We can't interfere. It's nature, it's—" But his words died as the bear made another sound, soft and pleading, unlike anything he had heard from a bear before. She nudged the still cub again, then looked back at them, waiting. The 2 living cubs were crying for their mother, but she remained focused on this impossible communication. this bridge she was trying to build between their two worlds. Lily stood suddenly, decision clear on her face. "I'm going out there," she said, passing the baby to Ethan. "No," he said immediately, but she was already moving toward the door. "Lily, you can't. She's a wild bear. She could—" But Lily turned to face him, and in her eyes was the same fierce determination he had seen in the bear's. "She's a mother asking for help," Lily said simply. "I have to try." And before Ethan could stop her, she was opening the door, stepping out into the silver moonlight. The bear didn't move as Lily approached, just watched with those impossibly expressive eyes. Lily moved slowly, speaking in the same soft, musical tone she used with their baby. "It's okay, Mama," she said. The words meant for comfort, even if their meaning was lost. "I'm here to help. I understand." She knelt beside the still cub, acutely aware of the massive predator just feet away but feeling no fear. The bear's eyes followed her every movement, but there was no tension in her body, no sign of aggression. The cub was so small in Lily's hands, barely 6 inches long, its fur still damp from birth. She could feel no heartbeat, no breath, but the body was still warm. Working from instinct and half-remembered first aid training, she began to massage the tiny chest, her fingers working in gentle compressions. She cleared the cub's airway, blowing the softest breath into its tiny nose and mouth. The mother bear watched intently, her body perfectly still except for the rise and fall of her breathing. "Come on, little one," Lily whispered, continuing her efforts. "Your mama needs you to fight. Come on." She had no idea if what she was doing would work, if bear cubs could even be revived this way, but she couldn't stop trying. Behind her, she could hear Ethan at the doorway, holding their baby, ready to act if the bear showed any sign of aggression. But the forest remained peaceful, waiting, watching this impossible moment of interspecies cooperation. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into eternity. Lily's fingers worked rhythmically, her breath coming in controlled puffs, as she tried to coax life back into the still form. The mother bear had moved slightly closer, close enough that Lily could feel the heat radiating from her massive body, smell the wild scent of her fur. It should have been terrifying, but instead, it felt like solidarity, two mothers united in the most primal hope. And then, impossibly, miraculously, the cub twitched. A tiny paw moved, then a shudder ran through the small body. Lily increased her efforts, her heart pounding with hope. Another twitch, stronger this time, and then a tiny mewing cry that was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. The cub was breathing, moving, alive. Lily's hand shook as she gently placed the cub closer to its mother, tears streaming down her face. The mother bear's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. She gathered the cub to her with infinite gentleness, licking it, warming it, her vocalizations changing to something that sounded almost like purring. She looked at Lily, and in that look was something beyond gratitude, beyond any human word. It was recognition, acknowledgement of a bond that should not exist, but did. Lily backed away slowly, her legs trembling, and made it back to the cabin where Ethan pulled her into his arms, both of them crying now. They watched from the window as the mother bear tended to all 3 cubs, now all moving and crying for milk. She positioned herself carefully, allowing them to nurse, but every few moments she would look toward the cabin, toward the humans who had become part of her story. The first cub, the one Lily had revived, seemed slightly weaker than its siblings, but it was nursing, moving, living. The sight was almost too beautiful to bear, this perfect family scene that had nearly been a tragedy. As the night wore on, they maintained their vigil, taking turns holding their own baby and watching the bear family outside. The cubs grew stronger with each passing hour, their movements more coordinated, their cries more robust. The mother bear dozed between feedings, but never deeply, always alert to her cubs' needs. It was a mirror of their own experience with their newborn, the exhaustion and vigilance of new parenthood reflected in this wild creature's behavior. Dawn was breaking, painting the mountains in soft pastels when the bear finally stood to leave. She had been nursing and tending the cubs all night, and now they were strong enough to travel. She picked up each cub gently in her mouth, moving them to the edge of the clearing, then returned for the third, the one Lily had saved. Before picking it up, she walked to the cabin, coming closer than she had ever come, until she was just beneath their window. She stood on her hind legs, bringing her face level with theirs through the glass, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. Three parents, united by an experience that defied explanation. The bear's eyes held an intelligence, a depth of emotion that would haunt Ethan's dreams for years to come. Then she dropped back to all fours, collected her cub, and melted back into the forest with her family, leaving only disturbed earth and memory as evidence of the night's events. Ethan and Lily stood at the window long after the bears had disappeared, holding their baby between them, trying to process what they had witnessed and been part of. The forest was waking up properly now, birds singing, squirrels chattering, the normal sounds of morning replacing the sacred silence of the night. But nothing felt normal anymore. They had been given a gift, a glimpse into something profound and mysterious about the connections between all living things. "Did that really happen?" Lily finally asked, her voice hoarse from crying. Ethan nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He had his photographs, had documented the entire event, but he knew he would never share them. Some moments were too sacred for the world, too pure to be reduced to social media posts or magazine articles. This was theirs and the bears, a secret shared between species that had somehow found each other in a moment of greatest need. Their baby cooed softly, reaching out with tiny hands toward the window where the bears had been. It was probably coincidence, a random baby movement, but it felt like acknowledgement, like their daughter somehow knew she had witnessed something extraordinary. They had moved to these mountains seeking peace and simplicity, a place to raise their child away from the chaos of modern life. They had found that, but also something more. A connection to the wild world that ran deeper than observation, deeper than photography or study. The clearing where the bear had given birth looked ordinary now in the full morning light, just a patch of disturbed earth among the pine needles. But Ethan and Lily knew they would never look at it the same way. It had become sacred ground, a place where the boundaries between human and animal, civilization and wilderness, had dissolved completely. They had been chosen, for reasons they would never understand, to be part of something ancient and profound. As they finally moved away from the window to start their day, to change diapers and make breakfast, and do all the mundane tasks of daily life, they carried with them the weight and wonder of the night's events. They had been witnesses to more than just a birth, more than just a rescue. They had been given proof that empathy and love transcended species, that in our most vulnerable moments we are all connected by invisible threads of understanding. The bears never returned to the clearing, though Ethan would sometimes spot evidence of them in the forest. Tracks, scat, claw marks on trees. Each sign felt like a message, a reminder that they were still out there, the mother and her three cubs, living their wild lives because of one impossible night when the barriers between worlds had fallen away. And sometimes, late at night when their own baby couldn't sleep, Lily would stand at the window and hum that same soft melody, wondering if somewhere in the darkness, a mother bear heard it and remembered. The story should have ended there, with the bears disappearing into the forest and life returning to normal. But 3 weeks later, something happened that proved the connection formed that night was far from broken. Ethan was photographing the sunrise from their back deck when he noticed something at the edge of the clearing. At first, he thought it was a shadow, a trick of the early morning light. But as the sun rose higher, the shape became clear, a perfectly arranged collection of objects that had not been there the night before. There were 3 small stones, smooth and round, arranged in a neat line. Beside them, a large pine cone, perfectly intact and placed with deliberate care. And finally, impossibly, a small tuft of dark fur caught on a twig, positioned like a flag. Ethan called Lily, and together they approached the arrangement, both knowing, without words, who had left it. The bears' tracks were clear in the morning dew, the mother's large prints and 3 sets of smaller ones. They had come in the night, had left this offering, message, thank you. She remembered us, Lily whispered, kneeling beside the arrangement. She came back to what? To show us they're okay? Ethan photographed the scene, but again, he knew these images were not for sharing. This was private, a communication between families that transcended language or logic. They left the arrangement untouched, a shrine to a night when the impossible became possible, when the wild reached out to the domestic and found understanding. Over the following months, these visits continued sporadically. Never the bears themselves. They were too smart to risk direct contact again, but evidence of their presence. Sometimes it was tracks deliberately left in muddy spots where they would be clearly visible. Once, it was a half-eaten honeycomb placed precisely where their window looked out. Each sign felt like a check-in, a way of maintaining the connection without endangering it. Their daughter grew, reaching the age where she could sit up on her own, and Ethan and Lily would often find her at the window, staring out at the forest with an intensity unusual for such a young child. They wondered what she remembered, if anything, of that night when she was just 3 months old. Would she carry some subconscious memory of witnessing the bears' struggle and triumph? Would it shape her relationship with the natural world in ways they couldn't predict? One evening, as the first snows of winter began to fall, they were sitting by the fireplace when they heard a sound outside. Not alarming, just a soft huffing noise that they had come to recognize. They moved to the window, and there she was. The mother bear, standing at the edge of the clearing with her 3 cubs. They were so much bigger now, round with winter fat, playful and strong. The family stood there for just a moment, visible in the porch light's glow, a living portrait of survival and thriving. The smallest cub, the one Lily had saved, was distinguishable by a slightly lighter patch of fur on its chest. It seemed healthy, keeping up with its siblings as they wrestled and played. The mother bear looked at the window one last time, that same intelligent gaze that had started this whole impossible story, and then led her cubs back into the forest. It felt like a farewell, a closing of the circle that had begun on that September night. Ethan and Lily knew they would likely never see the bears again, not like this. The cubs would grow, disperse, find their own territories. The mother would continue her solitary life, occasionally having other cubs, living out her years in the wilderness where she belonged. But the connection formed that night would never truly break. It lived in the photos Ethan would never publish, in the story they would tell their daughter when she was old enough to understand, in the way they looked at the wild world with new eyes. They had learned something profound about the boundaries we draw between ourselves and nature, how artificial and permeable they really were. In their moment of shared vulnerability, Lily with her newborn, the bear with hers, they had found a common language that needed no words. It was written in the universal experience of birth and death, fear and hope, the fierce love that drives mothers of all species to impossible acts of courage. As winter deepened and snow covered the clearing, erasing all physical evidence of that September night, Ethan and Lily would sometimes catch themselves looking out the window, remembering. Their daughter would join them, standing on unsteady legs, pressing her small hands against the cold glass. And sometimes, just sometimes, they would hear a sound in the distance, a low, rumbling call that echoed through the valleys, and they would wonder if it was her, the mother bear, also, remembering the experience had changed them in ways they were still discovering. Ethan's photography took on a new depth, capturing not just the beauty of wildlife, but the intelligence and emotion he now knew existed behind those wild eyes. Lily found herself more attuned to the subtle communications of their baby, trusting her instincts in a way she hadn't before. They had been given a gift of perspective, a reminder that humans were not separate from nature but part of it, connected in ways modern life often made them forget. The following spring brought unexpected changes to the mountain. The winter had been harder than usual, with deep snows that lasted well into April, and when the thaw finally came, it revealed a landscape transformed. Trees had fallen under the weight of ice, creating new clearings where none had existed before. Streams ran in different courses, carved by the relentless melt. And in the midst of all this change, Ethan noticed something that made his heart skip. Fresh bear tracks near their cabin, but not just any tracks. There was something familiar about the pattern, the size of the larger prints accompanied by smaller ones, though not as small as they had been that September night. Their daughter, now almost a year old, had developed an uncanny ability to sense when wildlife was near. She would stop whatever she was doing, her little head turning toward the window, her dark eyes focused with an intensity that seemed beyond her age. It was during one of these moments, on a warm May afternoon, that Lily saw them again. The mother bear was teaching her cubs to fish in the stream that ran behind their property, patient and methodical in her instruction. The cubs were nearly as large as their mother now, but they still followed her lead, watching as she demonstrated the precise timing needed to catch the spring salmon run. But something was wrong. The smallest cub, the one with the light patch on its chest, wasn't participating. It sat on the bank, its breathing labored, its movements sluggish. Even from the distance, Ethan could see that the cub was in distress. The mother bear kept returning to it, nudging it gently, trying to encourage it toward the water, but the cub would only move a few steps before sitting down again. The other two cubs continued fishing, but their mother's attention was divided, constantly checking on the sick one. "It's the same cub," Lily said quietly, her hand finding Ethan's. "The one I helped. Something's wrong with it." They watched for hours as the mother bear tried everything she knew, bringing fish to the cub, leading it to shade, then to sun, trying to stimulate its appetite and energy. But nothing worked. As evening approached, the bear family moved slowly upstream, the sick cub lagging behind, and disappeared into the forest. That night, neither Ethan nor Lily slept well, haunted by the image of the struggling cub they had once helped bring back to life. The next morning revealed a scene that stopped their hearts. The mother bear was back at the clearing, the same clearing where she had given birth 8 months ago. But this time she was alone except for the sick cub, which lay on its side, barely breathing. The other two cubs were nowhere to be seen, presumably left somewhere safe while their mother dealt with this crisis. The parallel to that September night was unmistakable. Once again, she had brought her struggling baby to the only place where she had found help before. "She's asking for help again," Lily said, already moving toward the door. But Ethan caught her arm. "We can't, Lily. This is different. The cub is older, stronger, more dangerous, and we don't know what's wrong with it. It could be disease, something contagious. But even as he spoke, he saw the mother bear look toward their window with those same intelligent, pleading eyes. She made no aggressive moves, showed no signs of the fierce protectiveness bears were known for. Instead, she stepped back from the cub, actually backing away several yards, and sat down. The message was clear. She was giving them space, permission, trusting them with her baby once again. Their daughter crawled to the window, pulling herself up on the sill, and made a sound they had never heard from her before. A low, humming noise that sounded almost like the bear's own vocalizations. The mother bear's ears swiveled toward the sound, and she made a similar noise in return. It was impossible, Ethan knew, for a human baby and a bear to be communicating, yet he couldn't deny what he was witnessing. His daughter and the bear seemed to be sharing something beyond language, a recognition that transcended species. Unable to ignore the plea, Ethan made a decision that went against every principle of wildlife interaction he had ever learned. He grabbed his emergency medical kit and slowly approached the sick cub, talking in low, calm tones to both the cub and its watching mother. The cub was conscious but weak, its eyes following his movements without fear. As he got closer, he could see the problem: a deep wound on the cub's hind leg, infected and swollen. It looked like it had been caught in something, maybe old fencing or a trap left by poachers who occasionally plagued these mountains. Working carefully, aware every second of the massive bear watching him, Ethan cleaned the wound with antiseptic. The cub whimpered but didn't struggle, as if it understood he was trying to help. The infection was bad, beyond what his basic first aid could properly address. The cub needed antibiotics, proper medical care, but the nearest wildlife veterinarian was hours away. He did what he could, cleaning and bandaging the wound, but he knew it wasn't enough. The cub's eyes were glazing, its breathing becoming more shallow. It was then that Lily appeared beside him, carrying their daughter and something else, a bottle of antibiotics left over from her own post-birth infection. "These are safe," she said. "I researched it when I was breastfeeding." The same antibiotics they use for animals. Together, they managed to get the cub to swallow a dose mixed with water and honey, the sweet taste making the medicine palatable. The mother bear watched every move, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed almost like encouragement. They stayed with the cub for hours, taking turns monitoring its condition while keeping their daughter entertained nearby. She seemed completely unfazed by the presence of the bears, reaching out toward them with chubby hands and babbling in her baby language. The mother bear, incredibly, seemed charmed by the human baby, tilting her head and listening to the incomprehensible but enthusiastic sounds. It was surreal, this interspecies nursery they had created in the clearing, but it felt somehow right, like the universe had arranged this moment. As the sun reached its peak, the antibiotics began to work. The cub's breathing steadied, and it managed to lift its head and drink water from a bowl Lily had brought. The mother bear's relief was visible in every line of her massive body. She approached slowly, careful not to startle the humans, and gently licked her cub's face. Then, in a gesture that would remain burned in their memories forever, she touched her nose to their daughter's outstretched hand, the gentlest possible contact between wild and domestic, a thank you that needed no words. Over the next 3 days, this routine continued. The bears would arrive in the morning, and Ethan and Lily would administer antibiotics and clean the wound. The mother bear would fish in the stream, bringing food to her recovering cub, while the other 2 cubs gradually began joining these sessions, curious about the humans who had become part of their family's story. Their daughters seemed to consider it all perfectly normal, laughing when the cubs play wrestled near her, clapping her hands when they successfully caught fish. By the fourth day, the cub was notably better, able to walk and even play a little with its siblings. The wound was healing cleanly, the infection defeated. Ethan knew they had crossed every boundary of proper wildlife management, but he couldn't bring himself to regret it. They had been chosen somehow to be guardians for this bear family, and they had accepted that role with all its implications. The mother bear seemed to understand that her cub was healing, and her demeanor changed from desperate worry to something approaching gratitude. On the fifth morning, they waited, but the bears didn't come. Ethan hiked carefully through the forest, following tracks, and found evidence that the family had moved on, heading higher into the mountains where the summer grazing would be better. It was the right thing, the natural thing. The cub was healed enough to travel, and staying near humans any longer would have been dangerous for everyone. But the absence felt like a loss, a quiet grief for a connection that had been as intense as it was impossible. Life returned to a different kind of normal. Their daughter took her first steps in the same clearing where she had witnessed birth and near death, her small feet following paths that bears had walked. Ethan returned to his photography, but his images carried a new depth, an understanding of the intelligence and emotion that existed in the wild world. Lily found herself looking at all animals differently, seeing in them the same capacity for love and fear and hope that the mother bear had displayed. Summer turned to autumn, painting the mountains in brilliant reds and golds. Their daughter was walking confidently now, exploring their small world with endless curiosity. She had a particular fascination with the clearing, often toddling out to stand in the exact spot where the bears had been, looking into the forest as if waiting for something. Ethan and Lily had tried to explain, in simple terms a toddler could understand, about the bears they had helped, but they weren't sure how much she comprehended. Still, she seemed to carry some memory or instinct about them, a connection that transcended her young age. It was on the anniversary of that first encounter, a September evening with the same quality of light that had illuminated the original birth, that they saw them again. All four bears emerged from the forest as the sun set, their coats glossy and healthy, ready for the coming winter. The cubs were enormous now, nearly indistinguishable from adult bears except for their playful behavior. The one they had saved twice bore a small scar on its leg, but it moved without any sign of lasting damage. The mother bear approached the cabin more closely than she had in months, standing beneath their window where they watched with their daughter. In her mouth, she carried something that she placed carefully on the ground, a perfect honeycomb dripping with golden honey, positioned exactly where they would find it. Then she stood on her hind legs, reaching her full, impressive height, and placed one massive paw against the window. On the other side of the glass, their daughter placed her tiny hand against the bear's paw, a moment of connection that Ethan managed to capture in a photograph he would treasure forever, but never share. "Bye-bye, bear," their daughter said clearly, her first complete sentence, waving with her free hand. The bear dropped back to all fours, gathered her cubs with a series of soft grunts and led them back into the forest. This time, both Ethan and Lily knew it was truly goodbye. The cubs would disperse soon, finding their own territories. The mother would continue her solitary life, perhaps having other cubs in years to come. Their paths had intersected for this brief, impossible season, and now they would diverge again as they should. But the impact of those encounters rippled outward in ways they couldn't have predicted. Their daughter grew with an unusual sensitivity to animals, able to calm frightened dogs with a touch, attracting birds that would eat from her hand. She would tell stories, as soon as she could string sentences together, about the mama bear and her babies, memories that seemed too vivid for a child who had been so young. Ethan's photography evolved, capturing not just the beauty of wildlife, but the personalities, the individual stories that each animal carried. They never saw the bear family again, though they would occasionally find signs, tracks that seemed deliberately placed, marks on trees that felt like messages. Other bears passed through their property over the years, but none ever approached the cabin. None ever asked for help. It had been a unique convergence of circumstances, need, and trust that had created their story, unlikely to ever be repeated. They had been given a gift, a window into the emotional lives of creatures usually seen as simply wild, dangerous, other. Years later, when their daughter was 5, old enough to understand more complex ideas, they told her the complete story of the bears. She listened with rapt attention, asking questions that showed a deep understanding of the significance of what had happened. "The mama bear knew you would help," she said, with the simple certainty of a child. She remembered that humans could be kind. It was a profound statement from such a young child, but then she had been shaped by this experience in ways they were still discovering. They decided then to share the story more widely, not through Ethan's photographs, which remained private, but through words. They wrote it down, all of it, the fear and wonder and impossible trust that had defined those encounters. They sent it to a wildlife journal, thinking perhaps it would help people understand that the boundaries between human and animal were not as fixed as they seemed. The response was immediate and intense, some calling them irresponsible, others finding in their story a hope for better relationships between humans and wildlife. But the criticism didn't matter. They knew what they had experienced was real and profound. They had been chosen, for reasons they would never fully understand, to be part of something larger than themselves. The mother bear had trusted them with her most precious possessions, her cubs, and they had honored that trust. In return, they had been given a glimpse into the rich emotional lives of creatures too often dismissed as mere instinct-driven beasts. The clearing remained a sacred space for their family. They would often have picnics there, their daughter playing while Ethan and Lily remembered those incredible nights and days. Sometimes she would stop her playing and stand very still, looking into the forest with an expression of deep concentration. "I can feel them," she would say. "They're happy." Whether it was imagination or some deeper connection formed in her infancy, they never questioned it. The bears had become part of their families' mythology, a story that shaped their understanding of their place in the world. One winter evening, as snow began to fall, they were decorating their Christmas tree when their daughter asked an unexpected question. "Do you think the bear cubs remember us?" Lily and Ethan exchanged glances, considering how to answer. Finally, Ethan said, "I think they remember the feeling of being safe, of being helped when they needed it. And maybe that's enough, to know that kindness exists between all living things, even when it seems impossible." Their daughter nodded, satisfied with this answer, and returned to hanging ornaments. But later that night, as they tucked her into bed, she said something that made them both catch their breath. "The mama bear told me, 'Thank you,'" she said sleepily. "Not with words, but I understood." They didn't ask when or how this communication had happened. Some mysteries were better left unexplored, some connections too precious to analyze. The story of the bears became a cornerstone of their daughter's childhood, shaping her into someone who saw the world differently. She grew up to be a veterinarian, specializing in wildlife rehabilitation, driven by a deep understanding that animals were not so different from humans in the ways that mattered. She would tell her patients' owners about the bears, about the night a wild mother trusted humans with her babies, and how that trust had been honored and returned. Ethan continued his photography, eventually publishing a book about wildlife behavior that challenged conventional understanding of animal intelligence and emotion. He never included the photos from those encounters with the bears, keeping that story separate, sacred. But his other work was informed by what he had witnessed, by the tears he had seen in a mother bear's eyes, by the deliberate choice she had made to seek help from traditional enemies. Lily became an advocate for wildlife corridors and protected spaces, working to ensure that animals had safe passages through increasingly developed landscapes. She would speak at conferences about the importance of coexistence, of recognizing that humans and wildlife shared the same spaces, the same needs, the same capacity for suffering and joy. She never told the full story of the bears at these events, but those who knew her could see its influence in every word she spoke. The cabin in the mountains remained their true home, even as life took them to other places for work and education. They would return every summer, and often in September, around the anniversary of that first encounter. The clearing had grown over somewhat, young trees beginning to fill in the space, but they could still see where it had all happened. Their daughter, even as a teenager and young adult, would stand in that spot and close her eyes, as if listening to something only she could hear. One September, when their daughter was 25 and home from veterinary school, they were sitting on the porch when she suddenly stood up, alert. "Something's coming," she said, with the same certainty she'd had as a child. They waited, watching the tree line, and then they saw it. A lone bear, massive and scarred, moving with the careful dignity of age. It wasn't the mother bear. They knew she would be gone by now, bears rarely living past 25 in the wild. But there was something familiar about this bear, something in the way it moved. It came to the edge of the clearing and stood there, looking at the cabin. There was a light patch on its chest, faded with age but unmistakable. It was the cub Lily had saved, now fully grown, returning to the place where its life had begun and been saved twice. The bear didn't approach closer, didn't stay long, just stood there for a few moments as if paying respects to a memory. Then it turned and melted back into the forest, leaving them stunned and moved beyond words. "It remembered," their daughter whispered, tears streaming down her face. "After all these years, it remembered." They sat together in silence, 3 generations of a story that had begun with birth and near death, with impossible trust and improbable connection. The bear's visit felt like a closing of a circle, a final acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged so many years ago. They never saw that bear again, but its visit had given them something precious. Confirmation that what they had experienced had been as significant for the bears as it had been for them. The memory had been carried through the years, perhaps passed somehow from mother to cub, a story in the language of scent and sound and behavior that said, "These humans can be trusted. These humans helped us. These humans are part of our story." The impact continued to ripple outward. Their daughter specialized in treating orphaned wildlife, developing new techniques for raising and releasing animals that maintained their wild instincts while receiving necessary care. She would often work with bears, and colleagues would marvel at her ability to read their behavior, to calm them without sedation, to somehow communicate across the species barrier. She never explained that she had been doing this since before she could properly walk, that her first interspecies friendship had been with a family of grizzly bears. Ethan's photographs, the ones he eventually decided to share, became part of a major exhibition on animal intelligence and emotion. He included one image from those encounters, not of the bears themselves, but of the honeycomb they had left as a gift, glowing golden in the morning sun. The image was titled simply, "Thank You," and became one of the most discussed pieces in the exhibition. People saw in it evidence of something they had always hoped was true, that animals were capable of gratitude, of deliberate communication, of choosing connection over isolation. Lily wrote a book about the experience, carefully changing details to protect the location and the bear's privacy. It became required reading in several wildlife management programs, challenging traditional approaches to human-wildlife interaction. She received letters from around the world, from people who had their own stories of impossible animal encounters, of moments when the boundary between wild and domestic had dissolved. It seemed their story had given others permission to share their own, to acknowledge that sometimes the rules we've created about nature don't match the reality of it. But the most profound impact was on their understanding of their place in the world. They had been given proof that humans were not separate from nature but part of it, connected in ways that science was only beginning to understand. The bears had chosen them, trusted them, thanked them in the only way they could. In return, they had been given a glimpse into the rich inner lives of creatures too often seen as other, as less than, as simply animal. Their daughter married a fellow veterinarian, someone who understood and valued her unique gift with animals. When she became pregnant with her own child, she returned to the cabin, drawn by the same instinct that had brought the mother bear there years ago. She wanted her child to be born in proximity to that sacred clearing, to be welcomed into the world in a place where miracles had happened, where the impossible had become possible. The birth was uncomplicated, a healthy baby girl born as the sun rose over the mountains. As Lily held her granddaughter for the first time, she thought about cycles, about how stories repeat and evolve across generations. This child would grow up knowing the story of the bears, would understand from the beginning that the world was full of connections waiting to be discovered, full of trust waiting to be earned and honored. They named the baby Hope, after the feeling that had sustained them through those long nights with the bears, the belief that kindness could bridge any gap, that love was truly universal. As they introduced Hope to the clearing, now much changed but still recognizable, a red-tailed hawk circled overhead, crying out in what sounded like a welcome. The mountains themselves seemed to acknowledge this new life, this continuation of a story that had begun with another birth, another mother, another leap of faith. That night, as they sat on the porch with baby Hope sleeping peacefully, they heard a sound that made them all freeze. The distinctive grunt of a bear, close but not too close. They never saw it, but they knew it was there, watching from the safety of the trees. Whether it was the same bear that had visited years ago, or another drawn by some ineffable connection to this place, they couldn't know. But its presence felt like a blessing, a recognition that the bond forged between their families transcended individual lives. The story of the bears became Hope's favorite bedtime story, told and retold with small variations but always the same. Heart, a mother's love, a family's trust, the kindness of strangers who became friends. She would grow up, they knew, with a different understanding of the world than most children. She would see animals not as other but as relatives, distant perhaps, but connected by the same threads of emotion and need that connected all living things. As Hope grew, she showed the same sensitivity to animals that her mother had, the same ability to calm and communicate that seemed to run in their family now. Whether it was genetic or learned, nature or nurture, didn't matter. What mattered was that the gift given by the bears continued to flow through generations, shaping humans who saw the world differently, who understood that the boundaries we draw are often artificial, that connection is possible across any divide if we're brave enough to reach for it. The cabin became a pilgrimage site of sorts for their family, a place to return to when life felt disconnected or difficult. Standing in that clearing, remembering those nights of birth and death and resurrection, they would find again the thread that connected them to something larger. The bears had given them that, a sense of belonging not just to human society but to the larger community of life, a membership earned through compassion and trust. Years turned to decades, and the story of the bears became family legend, told at gatherings, passed down like an heirloom. Each telling added new dimensions, new understanding, as science caught up with what they had witnessed. Studies showing that animals did indeed have complex emotions, that they could form attachments across species, that they possessed types of intelligence we were only beginning to recognize. Their story had been ahead of its time, a glimpse into truths that were slowly being acknowledged by the wider world. Ethan passed first, peacefully, in the cabin he loved, looking out at the clearing where it had all begun. His last words were about the bears, about the gift they had given him of seeing the world through different eyes. Lily scattered some of his ashes in that clearing, returning him to the place where his understanding of life had been fundamentally changed. That night, she swore she heard bears in the distance, calling to each other in the darkness, and she chose to believe they were saying goodbye. Lily lived another 10 years, long enough to see Hope graduate from veterinary school, following in her mother's footsteps, but with her own unique path. At her graduation, Hope spoke about the bears, about how a story from before her birth had shaped her entire life, had given her a mission and a purpose. She spoke about the responsibility that comes with breaking down barriers, with being trusted by those who have every reason not to trust. The speech went viral, touching something deep in people who yearned for connection with the natural world. When Lily passed, also peacefully, also in the cabin, the family gathered to remember and celebrate. They told the story of the bears one more time, all together, each adding their own memories and perspectives. Hope's mother, now in her 60s, spoke about how the bears had taught her that motherhood was universal, that the fierce love she felt for Hope was shared by every mother of every species. Hope spoke about carrying the story forward, about ensuring that her own children would know that they were part of something larger, connected to all life through threads of compassion and understanding. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Hope walked out to the clearing alone. The moon was full, just as it had been that first night so many years ago. She stood where her grandparents had stood, where her mother had knelt to revive a dying cub, where so much had happened that shouldn't have been possible. She thought about time, about how stories echo across generations, about how a single act of trust could ripple outward forever. And then she saw them, not bears, but their signs, fresh tracks in the soft earth, deliberate and clear. A tuft of fur caught on a branch at exactly her eye level. And there, placed precisely where the mother bear had laid her dying cub for help, a single bear tooth, old and worn, left like a message or a memory or a promise. Hope picked it up carefully, feeling its weight, its reality. The bears of the original story were long gone, but their descendants remembered somehow, some way. The connection endured. She understood then that the story would never really end. It would continue in every animal she helped, in every barrier she crossed, in every moment of connection across the divide between human and wild. The bears had given her family a gift that transcended individual lives, the knowledge that we are all part of the same story, all connected by invisible threads of need and love, and the possibility of understanding. The clearing might grow over completely, the cabin might eventually fall, but what had happened here would ripple outward forever, changing hearts and minds in ways they would never fully know. As she walked back to the cabin, the tooth carefully pocketed, she heard it, a sound that made her stop and smile through tears. It was faint, carried on the wind from high in the mountains, but unmistakable. A bear's call, long and low, that seemed to say, "We remember, we continue, we are still connected." Hope raised her hand in a wave to the darkness, to the descendants of bears who had trusted her grandparents, to the ongoing story of connection and compassion that defined her family's legacy. The next morning, she would return to her life, to her practice, to the daily work of healing and helping. But she would carry with her the knowledge that she was part of something ancient and ongoing, a story that began with a mother bear's desperate trust and continued with every choice to see animals not as other, but as kin. The bears had taught them that love was the only universal language, that compassion could bridge any gap, that the impossible became possible when beings chose to see each other truly. The tooth became a family talisman, passed from hope to her daughter and beyond, a physical reminder of a story that shaped generations. Each holder would add their own chapter, their own encounters with the wild world that proved again and again that the boundaries we perceive are illusions. That connection is always possible if we're brave enough to reach for it. The bears had shown them the way, had trusted them with the most precious gift, the knowledge that we are never truly alone, never truly separate, always part of the larger family of life. And so the story continued, not ending but transforming, each generation finding new meaning in that original encounter. Scientists would eventually prove much of what the family had witnessed, that animals had complex emotional lives, that they could form cross-species bonds, that they possessed consciousness in ways we were only beginning to understand. But for the family, no study was needed. They had been given proof in the most direct way possible, through experience that transcended explanation. The clearing in the mountains remained, changed but still present, a physical anchor for a story that had become larger than any one place. Sometimes hikers would pass through and feel something, a presence or a peace they couldn't explain. The family never put up a marker or a sign, never tried to claim or explain the space. It belonged to the mountains, to the bears, to the ongoing story of connection between all living things. It was enough to know it was there, that it had been the stage for something miraculous, something that proved the world was far more magical and connected than most people ever realized. In the end, the story of the bears was about trust. The trust the mother bear had placed in humans she had every reason to fear, the trust the humans had shown in return, and the trust that had been passed down through generations like a sacred inheritance. It was about the courage to reach across difference, to see kinship where others saw danger, to choose love over fear even when all logic suggested otherwise. The bears had given them that courage, had shown them that the impossible was just another word for something that hadn't happened yet.